Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, the 14th of December, 2023, and the seventh day of Hanukkah, which means that the final night of Hanukkah is tonight, and we will kindle all 8 lights on our Chanukiot, our Hanukkah menorahs. So I hope that your festival has been festive and opportune, coming as it does at the end of just this dark, horrific stretch for the Jewish community and for Israel. May the lights of Hanukkah be a beacon illuminating a hopeful path ahead. That's my prayer. Speaking of prayer, why don't we begin with bracha and give thanks for this opportunity to engage and immerse ourselves in study for the last time for a little while, and then I'll give just another housekeeping announcement or two about the kind of fun, slightly diverse list of topics that we'll have the opportunity to study this winter before resuming our Talmud study on the first day of spring. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Today we are learning Bavli, Sanhedrin 74a. So the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, page or daf 74a. In a way, this picks up themes that we have encountered previously this fall, which of course is my intention, is to kind of have one more chance to reflect on the ethics of war as provided through the sacred Jewish literature, specifically Gemara, through the Babylonian Talmud. So some of the topics that we're going to visit today, we're actually revisiting. So the goal here is not to rehash, but to revisit, refine, review, and enhance our understanding of one core concept that applies in war, and especially applies in the kind of asymmetric war into which Israel has been basically dragged. I think obviously against its will, but necessarily of its will, since October 7th. And asymmetric war is not unfamiliar. It really is the dominant condition of fighting wars where the enemy, at least from our perspective, if we or Israel is the protagonist, then the enemy often fights from a position of asymmetry, meaning that the enemy's forces may be much more meager, at least in terms of conventional measures of military strength, numbers, quantity and quality of armaments, what have you, ability to defend itself against militarized aggression. And yet, the tactics that are employed by the enemy are such that they elicit a necessary response with force of arms, but cannot be met with equal measures of belligerence. So that's what we're really talking about, or put in kind of like layman's terms, or applying these theoretical terms to the actual situation on the battleground. How to deal with an enemy that, for instance, employs tactics of terror, targeting civilian populations with an appropriate military response. And by appropriate, I mean two things. One, what is appropriate in terms of the force of the response, the military force that's applied, but also what is appropriate in terms of the ethics of response. What constitutes a just response, given especially the fact that in this case, in the case of the war that Israel is presently fighting, Hamas, the enemy, embeds its terrorists among the civilians of Gaza in what is surely one of the world's most densely populated and squalorous areas. So that's the calculus that Israel's up against. And the word that is frequently raised in such conversations is proportionality. So today's conversation it's not a word that we're hearing for the first time in this class setting, but it is the word that will kind of connect all of the disparate pieces of text that we're going to look at today. Chiefly, we're going to look at one piece of very old text from the Babylonian Talmud, and one piece of relatively new text, an article that was published 15 years ago by the great scholar Moshe Halberthal. And we'll talk a little bit about who Halberthal is. He's actually close associates with Rabbi Jacobs, and by dint of their close personal relationship, has spoken at WRT a number of times in the past. So he is a person who, from a Jewish perspective and a legal perspective, knows a whole lot about the ethics of war, which is an area that is chief among his areas of academic interest. Chiefly, his area of academic interest is the Rambam, is the teaching of Maimonides. So he's particularly adept in seeing both how we take ancient Jewish legal texts, or Maimonides is medieval, and infuse a modern conversation about war with the wisdom of very, very old Jewish teaching. Okay, I see a hand up already. Oh, it's my mom and dad. Hi.
I just wanted to point out that on the front page of this morning's New York Times is an analysis: civilian dead, not sole issue in law of war, the idea of proportionality and response by Israel. So
Yeah,
just
exactly.
for further information, it happened to be on front page of this morning's New York Times.
Yeah, and I actually got a sneak preview of that article because I think it was published a day or two ago on the digital edition, and well worth a read because it really covers a lot of the ground that we're going to endeavor to explore today. So thanks for pointing it out. And if somebody is able to access it online and wants to put a link in the chat window, that's great. If not, I'll provide it in the follow-up memorandum that Natalie will send out to our class list. Okay, so we've blessed. We've introduced. It's time to engage our study. So I'd like to begin with Talmud today, having set up what we're talking about. But I want to make it really clear that this text is a little bit tangled. So it's going to take us some time just to sort out the threads and make sense of it. And I'll do my best, but I'm hardly an expert. I'm much more of just an enthusiast. So we're looking at the very beginning of Sanhedrin 74a. Sanhedrin, as the name suggests, is largely about court cases. The Sanhedrin being the judicial body assembled of Israelite elders. In the minds of the rabbis, the Sanhedrin may be something that it never was historically. You know, it was remember that the Babylonian Talmud is written, first of all, in diaspora, not in Eretz Yisrael, the Babylonian Talmud, that is. Secondly, that it's written from the vantage point of centuries and centuries after biblical history is concluded. So when it talks about this body of elders or judicial authorities invested with certain power to adjudicate law in the ancient Israelite society, it is a retrojected or imagined entity that the rabbis superimpose both what they know from biblical text and biblical law, and mostly their own imagined reality. So, of course, written from their vantage point, this text is used to bolster the rabbinic view of Jewish jurisprudence, and not necessarily should it be interpreted as an accurate read on what actually happened in Jewish history. So in that way, it's entirely similar to the rest of the Talmud. It draws on imagined biblical or kind of like reconstructed biblical norms to produce rabbinic teaching. All right, so we're picking up midstream. What I need to do is actually bring us to the case in question. We're going to look at this. The case in question is the case of the rodef, and we've talked about the rodef. The rodef is the pursuer. So the rabbi that we're looking at is this fellow, Rabbi Yonatan ben Shaul, Jonathan, son of Saul. And it reminds us of the case of the rodef that we studied many weeks ago, the rodef being the pursuer. If a pursuer was pursuing another to kill him, and one was able to save the pursued party without killing the pursuer, but instead by injuring him in one of his limbs, but did not save him in this manner, but rather chose to kill him, he is executed on his account as a murderer. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. And let me just revisit this for us so that you can be refreshed in your memory of what we're talking about. The case of the rodef, again, we studied it many weeks ago. We actually looked at Tractate Sanhedrin, Daf 72A and B, I believe. So we're just going back 2 pages, which actually covers a lot of ground in Talmud. You know, it can take hours to read 2 pages of Talmud, but the case is introduced of the rodef, that is to say, the one who is pursuing another with malign intent, well, specifically homicidal intent. Like if it can be assessed that you as a bystander observe or are in a position to intervene in the case of a person who is pursuing another person, the pursued, with the intent to kill, one is authorized to kill the pursuer. Now, we talked about this in the context of the war. I also referred to this teaching as instrumental in the understanding of the mindset in the ultra-Orthodox community, and not universally, but within certain parts of the ultra-Orthodox community, that back in 1995 gave halachic permission to the murder of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, right? So extrapolated out from its narrowest context of, let's say, Arlene Goldsmith is running from a person on the streets of Manhattan with a gun drawn, and clearly I can deduce as a bystander in close proximity to this terrible situation unfolding in front of my very eyes that this person wants to kill my friend Arlene. Doesn't matter that she's my friend. She's apparently just the pursued. I am authorized by Jewish law to take out the pursuer, even by killing him, right? So that's the norm that's being set up. Now, extrapolated out from this very immediate, almost like hyper literal interpretation of the law, we see what I would call an abusive extrapolation of the law to suggest that because Yitzhak Rabin, it was argued, was jeopardizing the lives of Israelis through his efforts to negotiate a peace settlement, trading land for conclusive peace with the Palestinians, and specifically with Yasser Arafat, who, even by people who were more moderate than this, had a, say, squeamish relationship, given the fact that many still viewed him as a terrorist with blood on his hands through his leadership of the PLO. And for the number of you who are taking my Sunday Israel history of Zionism and the conflict class, these names and historic moments should be familiar to you. Because of this, it was, I believe, again, hideously, heinously argued, it would be justified to murder Yitzhak Rabin in order to stop him from jeopardizing the lives of Israelis by making peace with the Palestinians. Like, that is probably the most famous in my lifetime application, by far the most famous or infamous application of the law of the rodef. I believe that it's a really heinously twisted interpretation of the law, but you can see the way in which Talmud can be utilized for, I believe, both noble and ignoble aims, even today. I believe that the law is much narrower. It deals with one person who is pursuing another person, the would-be victim, the person who's in harm's way. So that's the case that's under discussion, but as is usually the way with Talmud, the permutations of possibilities that pertain in such a law are what must next be discussed in the Gemara. So now returning to the text. So we're really, the case we're talking about with Rabbi Yonatan ben Shaul is, well, what to do if you do not need lethal force to stop the pursuer. In other words, if it can be determined that I can stop Arlene from being harmed or killed by the pursuer simply by, for instance, shooting him in the legs if I'm armed and dangerous. if I can take out the pursuer without deploying lethal force, should I then do that instead of exercising lethal force? That's the debate we're really having here. So looking now at the text and kind of moving back and forth through the text so that you understand how it's being used. So I want to start here. The case here is a woman who's is being violated, being raped. And Abaye, one of the more famous Amoraim, later Talmudic sages from Babylonia, says, the ruling of the Mishnah is stated with regard to a young woman who was raped in a case where one was able to save her by injuring the pursuer in one of his limbs, so that it was not necessary to kill him in order to achieve her rescue. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yonatan ben Shaul. He's the one we're talking about today. As is taught in a Baraita, so now moving in our little rabbinic time machine earlier in time to the Mishnaic period. Baraita always indicates a Mishnaic period teaching. Rabbi Yonatan ben Shaul says, if a pursuer was pursuing another to kill him, and one was able to save the pursued party without killing the pursuer, but instead by injuring him in one of his limbs, but he did not save him in this manner and rather chose to kill him, he is executed on his account as a murderer. So again, the person who is being discussed here is actually the bystander who is able to deploy force to apprehend a bad guy from carrying out a potentially lethal act. If I have the ability to disable that person without using lethal force, I should or I must. And if I deploy lethal force where I did not need to, I'm actually culpable for murder. That's what's being discussed here. All right, does anyone need any pshat clarification? Pshat means the simplest sense of the text. In other words, we're just talking about the what and the how. We're not talking about the why or the deeper permutations of the text, which we're actually going to get to. Does everybody understand what Rabbi Yonatan ben Shaul's argument is here? Great. Take a moment to absorb it. Please also take a moment to consider why we're studying this text today. Right? So, because we're really talking about what is the Talmud teaching us about the use of lethal force in neutralizing an enemy who is capable of harm and demonstrates a willingness to perpetrate harm. Okay, so if the enemy now is not a person with a gun chasing Arlene down the streets of Manhattan, sorry, you're gonna like not sleep tonight, Arlene, but rather, let's say Hamas is the rodef, right? The one who by word and deed and precedent and action is clearly identifiable as a person with both injurious intent toward Jewish people and the means to carry it out, which October 7th proved beyond the shadow of a doubt. Now, how should the IDF respond? And the text would suggest that when necessary, lethal force should and must be applied. But if the enemy can be neutralized without lethal force, and one still chooses to react in a way that causes death, then the one who actually killed is not just killing in self-defense, it crosses the line from justified killing to murder. Which is why, by the way, just as a side note, I object to Jewish people translating the Ten Commandments law, lo tirtzach, as thou shalt not kill. That is not what the Hebrew says. The Jewish law is thou shalt not murder. And Jewish text, Jewish tradition, Jewish law takes great pains to differentiate between killing and murder. All murder is killing. Not all killing is murder. Sometimes killing is morally justified. Sometimes killing is morally required, right? So Judaism does not ask of its adherents, you and me and everyone else we know who's Jewish, to take a suicide pact, right? We are indeed a tradition of preserving life, first and foremost, our own. Very much in the vein of you got to put your own oxygen mask on before helping others. That was the text we studied last week with the canteen, right? The jug of water and the travelers in the desert. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch our class. Unfortunately, you can only watch the first hour, but most of the remaining half hour is actually just reading an article by Daniel Hartman called Fighting a Just War Against Hamas Justly, which amazingly was written in 2009. So that's what we did last week. In case you didn't see it, go back and refresh, right? We are actually instructed to preserve life, to save life, starting with our own. It is not Jewish to martyr oneself. There are exceptions to that rule. It is better to die than to commit murder, according to Jewish law, and that is reaffirmed by Maimonides. It is better to die oneself than to commit rape or incest, sexual crime. And it is even better to die than to commit idolatry, though that's very hard to prove, because idolatry isn't just what you do, it's what you think. So I'm not sure that that one's easy to regulate through the mechanisms of law, Jewish or otherwise. Having said that, 99% of the time, Jews are not asked to give up their own lives for the purpose even of saving another's life, right? You have to save yourself first. So in this case, it is imperative sometimes for one to kill another person in order to save one's own life. That is killing in self-defense. Murder is something completely different. And you can see that Jewish law, even at this early stage of its development, is really very nuanced and sophisticated in helping the reader, the practitioner of the Jewish way of life, Judaism, to differentiate between killing, sometimes necessary, sometimes mandatory, and murder, never permitted. Right? That's what we're really discussing here. And again, when one has the means to disable a foe without using legal force, one must. That at least is the basic premise being taught by Rabbi Yonatan ben Shaul here in his gloss on the law of the pursuer. Russell, you're up, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that explanation. A few weeks ago, we were looking at, maybe it was even in the context of rodef, and we concluded that proportionality actually was not a Talmudic concept. This seems to argue in favor of some kind of proportionality. And I put into the chat, one of my favorite passages from Deuteronomy, which is, and I say, fortunately online, I could not find a Jewish version of Deuteronomy, so I just took the one that I could find, which says that if two men get into a fight, wife of one of them jumps in to defend her husband and grabs the attacker by the genitals, you are to cut off her hand. And I confess I don't entirely understand the gender roles and all of that is being admonished here, but it is suggesting that there is some kind of proportionality in response. In other words, there are lengths to which she must not go to defend her husband. There are certain things that are off limits. And I wonder whether the passages that you have been showing us from Talmud, how does it relate to this this passage from Deuteronomy?
Thank you. I had totally forgotten about that passage from Deuteronomy. And
how can you forget that passage?
Sorry.
It's almost as good as stoning your children to death when they miss.
Yeah, maybe I've repressed it more than forgotten it. So I think that it's relevant. And I also think that there'll be more to say about that in a few minutes, because we're going to look at maybe not analogous, but let's call it a parallel case from Exodus, where again, the situation that is described, the scenario is two men fighting, a woman who is actually caught in the middle of the fight, though not because she wishes to defend her husband. You get the sense that the woman is just there because she's there. And then she actually ends up as a casualty. Well, we're going to talk about that case. I have not given enough consideration to the specific case in Deuteronomy, but Russell, I imagine you can apply both your Jewish text mind and your legal acumen to discussing the two of them and kind of holding these two cases and seeing where they are similar and where they are different. Even Jay.
To me, it seems that you're dealing in a different time and a different place. 1800 years ago, if a rodef is chasing somebody to do harm to them and a third party sees that person doing it, and they're using a knife or a sword, which you can knock away from somebody. Today, you'll see somebody chasing somebody with a gun. If you don't kill them, they may turn the gun on you.
That's right. And one of the I think great difficulties, not tactically but morally, that Israel is confronting in all of its recent wars, but I think it is in very high relief in this war, is the fact that modern warfare has depersonalized the enemy and made it possible to neutralize enemies from a great distance and without having to fight up close. And in fact, anyone who's engaged in war these days wants, of course, it's always about minimizing casualties to your own side. But in this case, that is made possible by weaponry that allows the belligerents to fight each other at great physical distance, which also, by the way, produces emotional distance, right? It's very different if you're sitting in a control room, secure in a bunker, near, 15 kilometers from the Gaza border, and you have a joystick in your hand and you're operating an unmanned drone that can level a building in Gaza City and inflict great harm on the enemy. That is both militarily advantageous and morally much more complicated than the scenario that Jay just described of, antique warfare, where it was bloody and up close and in your face, which is what is happening in the tunnels of Gaza, the tunnels under Gaza, which is the situation that Israel considers its nightmare situation, putting its own young men and women in uniform into the horrific situation of urban warfare, hand-to-hand or face-to-face combat in enclosed tunnels underneath Gaza. And therefore, Israel's primary aggression against Hamas in Gaza right now, or at least the casualties that have been inflicted, have by and large been the greatest the greatest proportion of those casualties have been inflicted through strikes, through airstrikes, both through manned aircraft and through drone. So, and war by ballistics, right? So Israel does not want to get into the kind of urban warfare that defined, seminal conflicts like Fallujah in the Iraq War, or much of what was so horrific about the footage coming out of Vietnam, and the kind of both physical and psychic impact of up-close war. This is a gruesome example, and I'm violating one of my own rules, which is never bring up the Holocaust in a situation that is not about the Holocaust. But when the Germans decided to exterminate the Jews as part of the final solution, the original mechanism of mass death were what was called Einsatzgruppen, which were roving killing bands that were sent out far and wide to villages with Jewish populations, significant Jewish populations. They would, round up all the Jews, force them to dig a grave, and execute them, right, at close range. And there are actually two important reasons that the Nazi high command changed strategy in its efforts to exterminate Jews, to move to put the Jews on trains and send them to large mechanized killing operations, murder operations, right? The death camps. One is that it was a more efficient way of murdering Jews. This is really gruesome. Forgive me for saying it in such a dispassionate way. Two, though, a lot of people don't recognize that one of the primary drivers of that implementation of the final solution, the death camps, was because Nazis were returning from these villages so psychologically scarred from what they were carrying out that they were less effective Nazis. This is true. Like the Einsatzgruppen was not a particularly effective way of getting rid of Jews because the soldiers weren't able to carry out their jobs as efficiently. It's sick, but it does speak to the point that I think Jay's question raises for us, which is that operating at a great distance is very different from ancient warfare, which was always up close. Okay. So let's keep reading a little bit of the Gemara, because it actually gets into the parallel case to Russell's example from Deuteronomy. Doesn't speak about genital grabbing, but it does talk in very parallel terms here. So, my Tama de Rabbi Yonatan ben Shaul dichtiv. Okay, so what is the reason, my Tama? What's the ta'am, or the reason? Ta'am also means flavor, but my Tama de Rabbi Yonatan ben Shaul. So what's the reasoning behind what Rabbi Yonatan ben Shaul is arguing? Just again, to recap, Yonatan ben Shaul is arguing that if you can neutralize an enemy, a rodef, a pursuer, with non-lethal force, you must. Otherwise, you may be culpable as a murderer yourself. Dichtiv, so here's the quote. Dichtiv just means as it is written. And then you can see the citation Shmot Kaf Aleph Kaf Bet, which means Book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 22. Okay, and this is the verse. V'chi enatzu anashim yachdav vagomer. So if men strive. Now, the text that's being described here is the case I just referenced. Two men are fighting. And let's actually look at it because Steinsaltz gives us the rest of it. And two men are striving, but strive is a terrible. They're fighting. They're in a physical altercation, and they strike a woman with child. So a pregnant woman happens to just get in the middle of this fight. Maybe it is the wife of one of the belligerents. Who knows? So that her fruit departs. Again, terrible. Like she miscarries. Right. Okay. So she gets caught up in this physical conflict. She's injured. And the fetus dies. And yet no further harm ensues. I know that sounds a little bit unfeeling, but the idea is that she herself is neither injured nor killed in the fight. So she is assaulted so as to produce a miscarriage, but she herself is uninjured or, not severely injured. He shall be punished. Presumably they mean the one who inflicted the injury, according to the demands that the woman's husband makes on him, and he shall pay it as the judges determine. It's a pretty loose translation, but the idea is that a monetary fine is negotiated and exacted from the aggressor for causing this presumably accidental miscarriage, but accidental is a term that needs a little bit of further analysis. And concerning this, Rabbi Elazar says, this verse is speaking of striving to kill, where each man was trying to kill the other. So this wasn't just like a tussle. It is clearly identified that the combatants here, the two men who are in this fight, are approaching their opponent with the intention to cause lethal harm, right? They want to kill the opponent. Now, how could that be determined from a third-party perspective? Hard to say. Obviously, the use of weaponry, right? The scene in West Side Story where the Sharks and the Jets have to decide what they're going to bring to the fight: chains, clubs, sticks, no knives, right? And that's the thing, but they show up for the big rumble, and both Bernardo and Riff have knives, and then you know what happens next. As Chekhov says, if you introduce a gun in Act 1 of the play, it has to go off by Act 3, right? So who knows whether or not it is easy or difficult to determine whether or not the aggressors in this case have lethal intent, but that's Elazar's assumption. The proof of that is written, but if any harm ensues, then you shall give life for life. So that's the following verse, see Exodus 21:23. In other words, Elazar says that the fact that the next verse describes a life for life penalty, lex talionis, the law of an eye for an eye, the fact that the Torah itself mentions life for life as a penalty is dispositive of the view that the two men were fighting with lethal intent. And if there was no intention to kill, why should he be executed? Right? So they're saying if this wasn't about trying to kill your enemy, then the Torah would have no reason to mention the death penalty, which it does. Even so, the merciful one states, God says, that's just another way of saying the Torah further says, and yet no further harm ensues, he shall be punished, teaching that he must pay the monetary value of the fetus to the woman's husband. So in other words, if lethal force is both used and successfully deployed, another person dies in this hand-to-hand combat, then the death penalty is exacted, right? The death penalty is imposed on the aggressor who killed. If not, the restitution is computed through a monetary assessment, through a fine. Side note, very important side note. This text is at the core of all later rabbinic argument up till the present day about the Jewish ethics pertaining to abortion. Now, there's no verse in the Torah that talks about an abortion. This verse, however, does talk about a miscarriage. And it directly conveys, I was about to say it suggests, no, it conveys that a fetus is not the same as an adult life, right? Because if a miscarriage results but no other harm ensues, a monetary fine is extracted from the one who injured. If a person dies, I'm saying person, adult, instead of fetus, the penalty is life for life. The rabbis derive from that difference the basic premise that a fetus is not to be understood as an adult life. And from there, the Jewish argument about the ethics of abortion unfolds. All right, that's a side note. If we were going to do a whole class on biomedical ethics in the Talmud, which we easily could, no, not easily, it would be very difficult for me, but I would enjoy preparing texts on biomedical ethics, so stick with me. I have no intention of stopping teaching Talmud. It's like, this is my thing now. I still need hiatuses. Sorry, I can't do it every single week. I need to actually prepare. But were we to go in that direction, we would use this text to understand what Jewish tradition says about abortion and the ethics pertaining to abortion. But that's not our goal today. It's merely a side note. It's a rabbit hole. However, it is interesting to note that a fetus and a person are not understood as the same in Jewish law. And this is the text from Exodus that is used to substantiate that claim. Mom and Dad, you had a hand up, and I'm curious what you were going to ask or say.
I was going to say exactly what you said. I
Right.
used this text when I was teaching 8th graders biomedical ethics about the status of the unborn, the fetus.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is, and I teach this text to high schoolers. Both, I actually use abortion in Jewish law, which is a pretty heavy and intense subject, but I use it as a first lesson plan of the year in helping kids understand how rabbinic text works, because it's actually fairly clear cut. Kids can understand it, and they can also relate to it because it's a contemporary issue. In other words, I'm able to, it works on two levels. One, we can talk about the content, but I can also make a strong case that these dusty old tomes are anything but, right? They have real, relevant, applied or applicable wisdom to bring to bear on contemporary ethical dilemmas. So, okay. So now we're talking about this case here. We're gonna keep going a little bit. So everybody understands what we're talking about. So again, we're talking about two men who, as Elazar suggests, are fighting with lethal intent, each man trying to kill the other. And the death penalty, capital punishment, is imposed if life is taken in this conflict, in this lethal conflict. Let's move on. Granted, if you say that in a case where one is able to save the pursued party by injuring the pursuer in one of his limbs, he may not save the pursued party at the cost of the pursuer's life. So that's back to Yonatan ben Shaul's main point. If you can neutralize the enemy through non-lethal force, then you should. All right. And if he killed the pursuer rather than injure him, he is liable to receive the death penalty. So that, again, if you accept what Yonatan ben Shaul teaches, that is how you find the possibility that the one who ultimately struck the woman would be punished. This would be in a case where it was possible to save the man under attack. In other words, the intended target of the first combatant's lethal aggression, i.e. one of the men who were fighting, by injuring the pursuer, that is to say, the other man who ultimately struck the woman in one of his limbs. In this case, the one who ultimately struck the woman was not subject to being killed. Therefore, he is subject to pay a fine. All right, that's Steinsaltz's gloss on this. So if it is possible to save somebody without using lethal force, it should be argued that one must save the other person through non-lethal force. Following? Okay. But if you say that even if one is able to save the pursued party by injuring the pursuer in one of his limbs, he can also save him at the cost of the pursuer's life. So if you are able to neutralize your enemy with non-lethal force, but you can also save him by using lethal force, how can you find the possibility that the one who ultimately struck the woman would be punished? When he was going, and this is Steinsaltz explains for us, when he was going to strike the other man, he was at risk of being killed. His life was in danger, as anybody could have killed him at that time. And the halacha is that anybody who commits an act warranting death exempts himself from any monetary obligation ensuing from that act. What they're really talking about, in a sense, is also we have two different punishments under discussion here. One is if non-lethal force is used, then the penalty is monetary. If lethal force is used, the punishment is capital punishment. All right, so how can you kind of decide between which penalty should be exacted here? And then the text goes on from there, and I think that it would get us very, very deep into the weeds. I mean, this is the way of Talmud. I actually tend to like stop the conversation before we get 6 layers in, because it's like playing chess. You really have to, well, you have to think about so many different things at once. You have to like keep reminding yourself what the argument is. It's a little bit hard to do that if we're not sitting with like the text in front of us where we can keep going back and forth. Audrey.
Okay,
Yeah.
I just had a thought. What if you're in a situation where you're fighting with somebody and you have, for instance, a gun? Well, like if I had a gun, I'd probably miss, which could mean that either unintentionally, instead of hitting somebody in the limb, I killed them. What if your intention wasn't to kill somebody, but to
Right.
injure them,
Right.
but you missed?
Right. And that's why I say I think that on paper, these situations are always much more clear than they are on the battlefield. Right. How do you know that the enemy intends to inflict lethal force? It's pretty easy if they're holding a weapon that can inflict lethal damage. It's much harder if you see two people in a physical altercation without weapons, right? And again, I think that the application here, again, rabbit hole, it would be interesting to see how poskim, that is to say, Jewish legal authorities, people who actually work with the ins and outs of the halakha for the purposes of adjudicating matters of Jewish law. So usually Orthodox rabbis who are noted for their Jewish legal acumen and scholarship. These people really do exist, and they are widely revered throughout the Jewish world, both the living and the dead. In other words, there are many poskim who are alive and in our midst and who are just widely regarded as kind of like, that's the guy you go to for a Jewish legal opinion. It would be interesting to see how they parse this in light, for instance, of Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd, right? Because then it has to be substantiated that by placing a, by apprehending somebody with a potentially lethal chokehold, that one had the intention to kill and not merely to neutralize through non-lethal force. Those are various applications of the same thing. All I want to affirm for you, Audrey, is that we don't know because we're not there. Like, all we have is a text that gives us these norms, but it is a reasonable question to say, but how do I know if the intent was to deploy lethal force or not? Mom and Dad?
Since there seems to be so little Talmud and so much Steinsaltz
Yeah.
in this passage,
Yeah.
I'm totally confused as to who they're talking about should be punished. Is it the pursuer or the guy who is trying to prevent the assault?
The second of those. It's the guy who's trying to prevent the assault, right? So how, and really zooming the lens out, what we're really talking about here is, okay, I'm the bystander, but in Jewish law, I am either permitted or even obligated to neutralize a person who is a clear and present danger to another person, right? That's the basic law of the pursuer. The pursuer is the aggressor, but the case we're studying actually pertains to the so-called bystander, who, again, bystander is a very interesting category in Jewish law. It's different from how it is in American law. There's no such thing as an innocent bystander, according to the Talmud. If you are a bystander, you are actually, to some degree or another, morally obligated. Now, you're not if your own life is in danger, right? I am not morally obligated to stop a criminal, even like if I see Audrey on the streets of Manhattan and there's a guy with a gun chasing him, if I am in a position to interfere without incurring lethal risk to myself, I should. But I'm not obligated to intercede if my own life is in danger, right? So let's say I'm at a concert, God forbid, and it's a mass shooting event, right? I am not legally obligated to stand between the bullet and a victim. I'm obligated to get the hell out of there, right? And I'm not held culpable for the people who are left behind at the venue at the time of a mass shooting in Jewish law. If there's a mass, God forbid, but I think about these things as the rabbi of a large congregation where hundreds of people are in a synagogue, as secure as I truly believe we are. If, God forbid, there were a mass shooting episode at WRT, we have lockdown protocols and whatnot, but it's fairly morally unambiguous that it is not the job of any one member of the Jewish community to incur the potentially lethal risk to one's own life in order to save another. But we are talking about the bystander, and I think the idea that the text is so exacting that if there is any way possible to neutralize a foe, neutralize a rodef, through the use of non-lethal force, one should. And they're using this example of the woman with the miscarriage to suggest that be forewarned, because deploying lethal force in any context other than when it is absolutely necessary incurs the death penalty, therefore is murder. The other thing that's important to know by way of background is that there's an underlying precept that has not been made explicit, but I think is helpful to know. Elsewhere in Sanhedrin, in this tractate, the Talmud states that one person cannot be charged in two different ways or twice for the same action, right? So what the rabbis are struggling with is, we see that potentially there's capital punishment to be imposed if it is determined to be murder. But there's also the matter of, if a fetus dies, there's also a monetary penalty exacted. And if you look at just the next paragraph, it actually clarifies that. It says, the Gemara tries to refute this reasoning. Perhaps the difference here is because two liabilities are not on account of the same person. Rather, one's liability to put to death is on account of this person, the one whom he killed, that is to say, the man with whom he fought, while his liability to give payment is on account of that person, the woman he ultimately struck. You know, it's because this scenario also supposes that there's an innocent bystander, another innocent person, that is to say, the pregnant woman, who's caught in the middle of this combat. Okay. other questions, thoughts? I know that it is a very tangled text, which is why I'm stopping here, because even I, like, my brain starts to get full and I'm like, wait a minute, how do we sort through all the strands here? And I studied this passage for the last many days and I listened to a bunch of commentary and I'm not sure I'm fully getting it. So very, very challenging material. So let's now, we've zoomed in the lens, let's zoom way out and ask ourselves, well, what do we do with this? How do we make a reasonable applied case? So what we're looking at here, what we're going to look at is an article that is published on the website of the Shalom Hartman Institute by the great scholar of Maimonides and the Jewish ethics of war, Moshe Halberthal, friend to WRT, who 15 years ago and more, almost 16 years ago, wrote a piece called War and Ethics in the IDF Ethical Code. The Ethical Code integrates proportionality and restriction into IDF operational policy, our attempt at maintaining moral integrity in the way we handle conflict militarily. That's a really awkwardly composed subtitle, but there you go. So we're actually going to skip down to the part that applies here. And that is, looking for it. Okay, principle of proportionality. Can everyone see the text? Okay, great. So this is an excerpt from an article, again, written almost 16 years ago, but could have been written, should have been republished yesterday for how applicable it is to where we find ourselves today. The principle of proportionality justifies the use of force by army personnel only in proportion to the mission she or he is assigned. This principle appears already in the Talmud, which permits the use of force against an assailant in self-defense. This category, known as din rodef, or the law of the pursuer, the law of the rodef, restricts the use of force with the following reservation. If one can save oneself from assault by limiting the damage to injury, then one is not allowed to kill one's assailant in self-defense. Does everybody understand that? If you're able to neutralize the enemy through non-lethal force, rather than using lethal force, you must. The principle of proportionality functions precisely according to the same considerations. Hence, when ordering soldiers to search a house, breaking the house door is necessary for carrying out the mission. Breaking the TV found inside the house isn't. Breaking the TV exceeds the proportions of the mission and is therefore unjustified and wrong. The strategic and tactical importance of the mission definition is quite obvious. Any officer will tell you that a mission poorly defined is doomed to fail. To this, I add the moral significance of mission planning because the use of force ought to be proportionate to the mission itself. And notice what he's not talking about. He's not saying that proportionality should be understood through the reductionist metric of body counts. Right? That is also the point that the article that my dad referenced that's published in today's Times, or the digital edition from the last couple of days, also makes. To this, I add the moral. So the use of force ought to be proportionate to the mission itself. What are the tactical objectives? And from that question flows what force must be deployed in order to achieve the objectives. Reading the first line of the Ethical Code section, Purity of Arms. He's reading from the IDF Code of Ethics, which is called Tohar HaNeshek, which literally means purity of arms. It doesn't have to do with the weaponry itself. It has to do with how Israeli soldiers are instructed to deploy their force, their use of force. Quoting, "The soldier shall make use of his weapon and force solely for executing his mission, only to the extent required." Observing this principle in combat is no simple matter. Right? So this is now, again, what I've endeavored to say this morning. There's a big delta between how we understand these principles on paper and then actually using them in the field of combat, where things are inevitably very messy, right? And clean forget about even just achieving tactical objectives. Achieving tactical objectives morally is incredibly difficult in the real world. Returning to the house from the previous example, once he destroyed the other party's capacity to threaten him, the soldier must refrain from using further firepower. The use of force is proportionate to the mission defined. But how many times in combat can we know with absolute certainty when our enemy ceases to be a threat? The discernment of combat conditions and matching them with the mission goal is one challenge. It is preceded, however, by a more fundamental question. How can we discern the moral criteria for defining the mission? What exactly is the mission when we blockade a city? We could say that it is aimed to stop terrorists from leaving the city and entering Israel proper. Alternately, we could aim to unsettle the life fabric of the general population in order to cause it to pressure its political elite to make political or military compromises. It therefore emerges that discernment is one of the biggest challenges the principle of proportionality poses. Discernment of the conditions within the combat situation and of the mission definition itself. So do you understand? So he's actually saying we have to talk about proportionality in three ways. He's given us two. One, within the mission. So this is what Daniel Hartman, in the article we looked at last week, defines as the ethics in war. But there's also defining how proportionality will be implemented or applied in defining the mission itself. This is what Daniel Hartman would call the morality of war. It's a very simple two-letter prepositional switch, but it really makes a very important distinction, right? In determining the morality of war, the combatant or the combatants, Israel in this case, must determine, first of all, is the war justified? And if so, what are the mission objectives? And how can we achieve those mission objectives in a way that is proportional and therefore moral? Once we're in battle, we also must consider the morality in war, how we execute the mission morally, right? So those are the two things, and Halberthal's argument lines up very neatly with the two categories that Hartman gave us last week. But there's a third. Okay, so to that we must add a third and final obstacle. Infantry troops are trained to fight upholding the drive for engagement, as it is called. That is, the requirement to engage with the enemy whenever possible. However, in the unique conditions of anti-terrorism warfare, we're back to where I really began today in my preamble. We're talking about the complexities of asymmetric war. The application of this rule may become highly complex. Many times, soldiers are hard-pressed to differentiate enemy targets from innocent civilians. The unfortunate outcome of off-beam targeting is familiar to all of us from the news. And how? In seeking to observe the principle of proportionality, the IDF had defined initially the military conflict with the Palestinians as a low-intensity conflict. Remember, this article was written in 2008. This means that military forces need employ greater discretion in the use of their firepower than in conventional high-intensity combat situations. I think that IDF is arguing today that the Palestinians are not a low-intensity conflict threat. But this definition contradicts the drive for engagement. The result is that an infantry brigade deployed in a Palestinian city is expected to keep its operational activity at low intensity when it is trained to maximize the intensity of any hostile engagement. Therefore, we find that the operation of any conventional army against targets embedded in civilian population leads to an asymmetrical conflict. And we're gonna talk more about why that's difficult. But Audrey, I saw your hand is up.
It may be about this last point, but how do you know that they won't be a recurring threat? And wouldn't that be part of the reasoning of the IDF?
Indeed, you don't know. And again, I think the IDF, the Israeli High Command, certainly views October 7th of dispositive the fact that Hamas has both the capacity and the intent to inflict further lethal harm on
Right.
Jewish civilian populations, which is why the IDF, Israeli High Command, does not accept the notion that a ceasefire is tactically desirable here.
Right.
Because it just leaves Hamas, back where we started.
And especially from our first class, that if we release all the hostages to get ours back, they said there was an article in the Times that said that the leader of Hamas was released from prison in that exchange for the soldier.
Yeah, I mean, the people who are being released from prison are not, by and large, rock-throwing Palestinian teenagers.
Right.
Some very bad actors with very bad criminal histories who, again, it is known to the IDF that the people who are being released back into Gaza have both the desire and the capacity to inflict harm.
Right.
It's an awful situation. I mean, if people are looking for Jewish leaders to provide hopeful, compact, concise, tidy resolution to where is this conflict going, I think that I am in the majority of people who say, I don't know, and I don't feel particularly optimistic. And I really do believe that it is not just a semantic difference to differentiate between being an optimist and being a person of hope. Hope is a religious commandment. I think we have to find a way to live in a way that is hopeful. But I'm not optimistic about Israel easily achieving its military objectives, particularly with the international pressure that is being exerted on Israel even today.
Right.
And those objectives include the safe return of the remaining hostages who are alive, which may be fewer than 100 at this point. Where there are 120 unaccounted for hostages as of today, but at least 19 are believed to be dead. So Israel's in a very, very bad situation. I think that point has not been emphasized enough, that this is Israel's worst nightmare.
Right.
To get into this kind of a war with Hamas in Gaza and then not actually be able to fulfill the stated mission objective, which is to neutralize Hamas for good, forever, and not have to do biannual mop-up missions, which is what Israel basically has been doing since 2009, 2008, at the time this article was written. I don't see, with optimism, a neat or swift way for Israel to do that. And that's even before we talk about the longer term, like what would peace look like? I think we still don't know what will this war look like. Sorry, happy Hanukkah. Mom and Dad, you're on.
A couple of points of clarification. I think the term that the Israelis were using to keep Hamas under control before October 7th was mowing the grass.
Yeah, right.
It's cynical in itself. Number two, as far as I understand, most of the prisoners that were released were in fact teenagers and those accused of, non-lethal crimes, throwing rocks, that sort of thing, although I don't disagree with Audrey's point that the number one Hamas guy was released in a previous. And as I understand it, those prisoners were released to the West Bank. You're not directly.
Thank you.
Right. The other thing I'm
going to trust that you're more up on that than I am. I'm
how
still
much
dealing
news,
with tremendous information saturation. So
you know how much news your mother consumes here. So
yeah, okay.
You depend on her. The other thing that I really wanted to bring up is, what does any of this say about preemptive strikes? And I guess to put it in the terms of this teaching, how do you know that the rodef is getting ready to commit the pursuit and possible murder? And when are you justified in intervening before the actual pursuit begins?
That's a whole other a set of considerations in Jewish law, and there is Talmud to bear on that. And I'm trying to remember, I'm trying to jog my own memory if we've covered any of that, because the Torah actually talks about preemptive killing. Obviously, it is a consideration in Israel, not only now, but every time Israel has gone to war. The most famous example is, of course, the 6-Day War, where Moshe Dayan and the High Command determined that a preemptive strike on Egypt's Air Force would be both warranted and necessary, and did indeed decisively turn the soon-to-be war in the favor of Israel in this incredibly dramatic victory. There's a book that I received as a gift this week, actually, called Rise Up and Kill. Great title of a book, which is apparently a real rocket page turner, which is a history of Israel's targeted assassinations program. So I'll know more about your answer. I'll have more to say about that, or I'll even loan you the book when I'm done with it, Dad, on Rise Up and Kill. But it's supposed to be just an awesome book about how Israel has deployed said principle of preemptive strike, not only at the kind of large military target level, but up close with specific human targets. Okay. So but the short answer is I don't have that at my fingertips right now. But it is absolutely part of the ethical consideration of the laws of war as conveyed through the Jewish tradition up until the present day. Okay, a little bit more Halberthal, and then we'll have time for some conversation around this. So he goes into the second section here, restrictive principle. Now we come to the second category of war ethics, that of restriction, which supersedes proportionality in importance. So basically he's saying, now we're going to talk about something that's actually even more important than what we've been discussing, which is proportionality. The restrictive principle forbids the targeting of non-combatants even when it is proportionate with the completion of the mission. Okay, again, 2008 he's writing this, but really important for us to be studying in 2023. This principle is reflected in the IDF's ethical code as follows. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons and force to harm human beings who are not combatants or prisoners of war. That's okay. So that may, be jarring for us to just sit with that line for a moment, given that the war that has been going on for almost 70 days has produced so many civilian casualties in Gaza. As Halberthal explains, one may only kill those who enter the game of combat. Those who do not partake of the war game cannot be included in your mission. It is therefore clear that the restrictive principle overrides the principle of proportionality. On the face of it, there couldn't be a clearer moral requirement. Everything changes, however, when the other party intentionally blurs the distinction between combatants and non-combatants by operating from within its civilian population. We know, again, could have been written yesterday. Halberthal clearly is thinking about the way Hamas engages in combat. Admittedly, there are radical cases in which it is morally permitted to make an exception to the restrictive principle, when your civilian population or your sovereignty is threatened. If Iran, for instance, were to attack Israel with missiles armed with chemical or biological warheads, many would justify a nuclear counterattack, even though it is likely to hurt combatants and non-combatants indiscriminately. And you have to understand that this in particular does evince a pre-October 7th, 2023 mindset. Because the idea up until October 7th, one of the many things that changed in the Israeli psyche on October 7th and after October 7th is the idea that no matter how bad Palestinians try to harm Israel, they don't actually pose an existential threat. And one of the questions that was raised immediately on and after October 7th has been, or do they? Does Hamas actually have the capacity to end Israel? In other words, if it can keep carrying out indiscriminate murder of thousands of Israeli civilians, does that change the calculus around the restrictive principle? he brings Iran in here because in 2008, the only massive existential threat that could be considered to Israel is a fellow nuclear power with the intention to exterminate the Jews and remove Israel from the map. But now you have a Palestinian armed terrorist organization that has explicitly declared its desire to eradicate Jews and the state of Israel, and that may have the capacity, if not through its own force, then through its allyship with other malign actors like Iran, like Hezbollah, which is a pawn or a puppet proxy for Iran. And frankly, part of the Hamas game is to use its engines of propaganda to, and that includes the UN, that includes the liberal West, media, some have said infiltrating academia with, Qatari money is part of this too, to move hearts and minds so as to eradicate Israel not through force of arms, but through delegitimization and boycott, to turn Israel into a pariah state that can no longer function as the safe haven for the Jewish people. Again, that's a calculus that for many Israelis who think about these things for a living, and those of us who are not Israeli who think about these things for a living, have been forced to consider and reconsider since October 7th. Is Hamas an existential threat to the Jewish state and the Jewish people? Existential means they threaten the ability to exist. See, I want you to understand why this is so important right now, and that he might not have used Iran as his only example of an existential threat if he were writing this in 2023. Okay. At this juncture, we must ask ourselves whether an asymmetrical conflict can also impose an there he goes, he says it, can also impose an existential threat on a civilian population to the point, I should say, that it warrants breaching the restrictive principle. The Iranian example is relatively straightforward, right? It's a nuclear power. But what about terror attacks? Is the threshold 12 dead victims a day? 20 victims a day? People's fear to travel on buses? How can we identify the condition permitting us to lift the restriction on our use of force against a hostile party? We'll come back to the radical examples, but in an ordinary course of asymmetrical warfare, there is the further challenge of deaths of non-combatants who are not targeted, what the Americans call collateral damage, appearing in the IDF ethical code as follows: soldiers will do all in their power to avoid causing harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property, meaning non-combatants. Let's pause here to take Aaron's comment or question.
I do wonder in this discussion if, in the effort to be so perfect in the way that they defend themselves, they actually appear weak to the people who want to take advantage of that.
Who's the they? I just want to clarify your pronouns for us, if you don't mind.
Well, it just seems like Israel, if they're not going to defend themselves against these, the debate over whether Hamas is an existential threat, I think, is different now than it was 2 months ago. But even if it wasn't, and Hamas were to do something like this and Israel did nothing, doesn't that just show everyone else who might be more existentially threatening that Israel will allow these things, quote unquote, to keep happening to their people and do nothing?
Absolutely. That came up actually in our very early discussion this fall. I think our first class after October 7th being a Saturday, so we're talking about like the 11th, was about redeeming captives. But one of the problem is a willingness of one party or a country to negotiate at exorbitant cost the redemption or the release of its captives signals weakness to the enemy and may encourage further malign action. Similarly, there's a lot that's being written and expressed and has been for years and years and years, but has come into high relief since October 7th about what is perceived to be strength and what is perceived to be weakness in the Middle East specifically. And it is generally, if colloquially, well understood that the basic rule of the Middle East is that strength is the coin of the realm. and that the perception of weakness only encourages the enemy. An example of that is frequently raised in conversations about the history of Hamas is Israel's disengagement from Gaza in 2005. At the time, the thinking by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was, probably the most aggressive military man in living at the time, with a checkered record of Israeli military leadership, by the way. He actually was the one who, from that very right-wing military history perspective, elected unilaterally to withdraw the IDF to outside the borders of Gaza and to dismantle all Israeli settlements, numbering almost 9,000 Israeli civilians living inside of Gaza at the time. We're going back to 2005. An act which, by the way, caused an uproar in Israel and in the Jewish world, with protests erupting in the streets of Israel's cities, portraying Israeli IDF who were evacuating the settlements as Nazis, as SS, as capos. It was really awful. And in the end, or at the time, the thinking was, if we withdraw from Gaza, maybe we can have peace. It was actually that helped bring Hamas to power in a violent coup 2 years later. And the conclusion, by and large, from the Israeli establishment is, you see, if you do something like that, it is perceived as weakness, and it is met with further terrorist aggression. So that's one small example of, I think, what Aaron is describing, that anything that is perceived to be weakness actually does not turn the temperature down. It tends to foment more Islamic violent extremism against Israel, precisely because it's interpreted as a sign of weakness, and the vulnerability can therefore be exploited. Arlene, Peggy, Michelle.
Lately, when I pick up the newspaper or I listen to television, I get very concerned about the victimization of the Palestinian people in the way the press is portraying everything. And I'm reminded historically of how many people in Germany knew exactly what the Nazis were doing, who lived in little villages, and they were not so innocent. Now, clearly, some of the Palestinian people knew that Hamas had some awful kinds of programs going on, with all of the underground tunnels that were being erected underneath schools, hospitals. They were not ignorant that this was going on. And the other thing that was very upsetting, which hasn't been portrayed enough as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that Hamas had all kinds of supplies to take care of their own population, but were not even sharing anything with the Palestinian people.
Right. Look, the Palestinians are victims. I believe that the Palestinians living in Gaza are chiefly victims of Hamas. I also think it is unreasonable to expect that the Palestinian street, that is to say, the kind of just the non-combatant Palestinian population, is to be understood as culpable for their own deaths because they are complicit with Hamas, given the fact that Hamas is a violent jihadist entity that has shown itself perfectly willing, able, and determined to treat the lives of its own citizens as valueless, and that tolerates no dissent, right? So what, other than a mass uprising movement, what are the Palestinian non-combatants in Gaza to do? They can't fight back against Hamas. They live in squalor. So I'm rather sympathetic to the Palestinian street, and I do view them as the victims of Hamas. I think that the West Bank is a whole other ball of wax, where culpability for the condition of the Palestinians is actually shared between the Palestinian Authority and Israel and Hamas, and that a significant degree of culpability should be laid at the feet of Netanyahu, his leadership, and his administration, which has allowed a repressive system to persist in the West Bank. And by the way, it's shared culpability. It's a co-created dynamic. The Palestinian Authority is equally culpable, as is Hamas, as is the Arab world, as is the UN. Right? The condition, whether you call it occupation or simply the fact that the IDF makes life, difficult at best and unbearable at worst for many, many, many Palestinians living in the West Bank, is a co-created dynamic that must require a co-created solution. So I do believe that, there are plenty of Palestinians who are aligned with the strategic objectives of Hamas, calling for the elimination of the state of Israel. And I believe that that is very problematic. I do believe that, today in 2023, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is a call to genocide of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. Does that make a Gazan non-combatant a legitimate target? No. Does it mean that we must consider the limits to collateral damage, which is what Halberthal is talking about at this point in the article, as a necessary condition of how the ethics of this war should be evaluated? I think yes. They are collateral damage, and minimizing collateral damage is a foremost condition in evaluating the ethics of war. Peggy.
I was just going to say, in response of pointing out in our just slightly previous discussion, that I think even though it might be a myth, there is something in the Jewish DNA about weakness during the Holocaust, that the Jews, like sheep, nobody resisted. They all went off to the slaughter. I know that's not true, but I think there is this sort of feeling that Jews don't fight back. And I think part of the Israeli thinking is never again, we're going to fight back.
Right. Oh, you are so right. This is an encapsulation of the Israeli psyche. Very much so. It's not, I would say it is part of the 21st century Jewish psyche, or even the 20th century Jewish psyche, but it is elemental to the Israeli psyche, right? As a collective. Israel forged its identity in the deliberate creation of a new Jew who would not lie down in front of violent aggression. It also, as a necessary condition of forging that new Jew identity, made it taboo to identify with the victims of the Shoah. Which is why when many Shoah victims came on those boats covered in filth and starvation and disease to Israel, they were often shunned by the Zionist settlement that had been in Israel in many cases for generations in 1948, 1945, right? Those families were very much disparaged, demeaned, looked upon as shameful to Israelis at the time of independence. It's very sad that, victims of the Shoah were often bluntly interrogated. Why didn't you resist? Why did you go like sheep to the slaughter? A reckoning with that difficult history has taken place over the last 25 years in Israel and directly led to the rebuilding and reimagination of Yad Vashem, which tells a very different story. Not of people who went like sheep to the slaughter, but of the 12-year terror reign of the Nazi regime, right? So, right, we have time for a few more questions. And when I send the note around as the recap to today's class and send the recording, I'll also send a link to Halberthal's article, where basically he says, in a world where many would choose either to lay down arms and just say, we can't deal with collateral damage, it's too much of a cost to pay for the price of achieving the missions of war, or we have to ignore collateral damage and kill indiscriminately, The rest of the article goes on where Halberthal's thesis is that we need a middle road that balances these two considerations. You got to achieve the mission, but you have to do it in a way that does not exceed a reasonable standard of collateral damage. How you define reasonable standard? Of course you can't. Okay, so let's take a few more comments and then we'll wrap for the day. And I do have to end in about 2 minutes. So if I don't get to everyone, I apologize. Audrey?
Okay, I think that it's very nice to say that you don't want to have collateral damage, but how do you know who was complicit and who wasn't?
You don't. That's
Right.
part of it. Right. And I think that's why post facto, many people are choosing to rationalize collateral damage by saying, well, there are no innocent Gazans. They're all Hamas. The problem is the Palestinians do that too, by the way. The Palestinians, and this is a propaganda point, they're saying those people who were murdered on October 7th, they weren't murdered. Everybody in Israel fights in the IDF. They're all either conscripts or reservists or future soldiers. So we weren't eliminating teenage dancers at a rave. We were eliminating future soldiers for the state of Israel. It's a morally horrific argument, as I understand it. But I want you to understand that I don't think that we serve ourselves well in viewed through the lens of moral philosophy to describe all Gazans as combatants. They're all, because they support Hamas. And I've even challenged the idea, what does it mean to support Hamas? Right? Do Putin's, millions and hundreds of millions of citizens support Putin? Well, you might too if the Gulag were the only alternative, right? Okay, Diane.
I know that people consider the Palestinians as downtrodden by Hamas, but there's got to be some of them who are cooperating with the Israelis and letting people know what they know about where Hamas is and what they're doing.
Indeed. And that is a very dangerous game for a Palestinian to play, to be an informant to the IDF. Watch Fauda.
Right, but are they being evacuated if they cooperate like that? Can they save them and their families and just get them out of there? That would encourage more of them to come forward.
I have no idea. But I have a feeling that IDF informants are not in a good place right now. Judy Gross.
Thinking about the Israeli psyche and the PR part of all of this, there is so little coming out. Somehow, how does Israel get better PR? It is, to me, everything is, there's such a sadness about where was their security. We talked to our friend in Israel. He can't believe that they were so unprepared. And there's the power of the Israeli power, which we talked about power in our, was it last week? Where is the power? Who's holding the water? It's not, Israel is looking weak and is looking bad. And the world hates Israel. And now all the anti-Semitism is rising. Where are the words that would tell we don't want to kill Palestinian babies? I mean, there's such an irrational, there is such an irrational, or there's no rationalism towards anything that gives Israel a positive spin. It's all bad.
I share your dismay over it, and I also share your lack of an answer. Because, that is the message that I believe communities like ours are engaged in creating and sharing with the Jewish people and the wider world and anyone who will listen. And I'm not hopeless. I have discovered a strong sense of allyship, not just in the Jewish community, but among many non-Jews here in Westchester and well beyond, who are willing to stand with us. But the greater sense is one of loneliness, abandonment, being misunderstood, and that our message isn't getting through. And there are so many reasons why. I think I joked last week that one of them that I've been sharing with other people when they ask me what the hell is happening on our college campuses, and I'll say it's the death of long form reading that you're seeing. Like when you get your news from TikTok,
oh God, yeah.
The idea of a Palestinian genocide is very compelling because it's very easy to make that case, and it does not matter that it is not factually true. Mom and Dad, you get the last word.
This may go to Judy's question of what's the source of all the bad PR. There was a snippet of a conversation that was reported between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu about collateral damage. And Netanyahu apparently said to Biden, well, after all, you guys firebombed Dresden and dropped nuclear bombs on Tokyo. And don't you think there was
On
a lot
Hiroshima,
of collateral damage? I'm sorry, on Hiroshima. And don't you think that was a lot of collateral damage there too that you guys did? And Biden said, much to his credit, is that, and that's why we have Geneva Conventions, international courts, and a bunch of, agreements that came to light after that to address that problem.
Yeah.
So I was very encouraged and pleased that that was our president's response to Netanyahu.
Yeah. Again, this is Israel's worst nightmare, that what happened has happened, and under Netanyahu's watch or failure to watch, I have tremendous empathy for Israelis because they are absolutely anguished over the fact that they have to fight this war, not just because it puts their boys and girls in uniform in mortal danger, which is something that every Israeli parent swears that they will not do to their children, knowing their own history, knowing the fact that every Israeli parent, for the most part, has worn that uniform and carried that gun, but also because it means that their children will have to kill in order to stay alive. Right? There's the fear of being killed, but there's also the fear of killing and what it will do to the psyche of their children. They're not just worried about their children's bodies. Israeli parents are worried about their children's psyches, their souls. And much of the blame that Israel is placing on for the war actually is on itself and on its government. This is all a chapter yet to be written and yet to be told, but big things are going to happen in Israel in the months and years to come. I have to depart. I'm so grateful to learn with you, as always. This concludes our semester of learning directly related to the war between Israel and Hamas. With any luck and a lot of love and strength, we won't have to talk about this in this way come spring, but we'll have new things to talk about. In the meantime, we have winter learning beginning the first Thursday in January, which I think is the 4th. Rabbi Jeffrey Middleman will be with us for a Zoom-based class, same time, different link. So you'll get information about how to sign up, 10:15 to 11:45 with Rabbi Middleman, called Judaism on the Vanguard of the Future, contemplating the ways in which Jewish text and Jewish tradition is in dialogue with some of the most revolutionary developments that are being made possible right in front of our very eyes here in the 21st century, from genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. It's going to be a really fascinating look, and he's a wonderful teacher and a total mensch. Brilliant, warm, engaging, and supportive. We're going to love it. I'm going to try and drop in as often as I can. And I'm still in development with Rabbi Jan Katsu for a late winter 4-session class on Maimonides, on Rambam. So much more good learning to come. Talmud Shiur resumes on March 21st. So Chag Sameach, Happy Hanukkah, an early Shabbat Shalom. Don't miss tomorrow night's services, where I'm going to provide my roundup of the 10 overlooked Jewish headlines of 2023, something that I hope will at least make us feel like all hope is not lost for the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition. I'm not going to talk as much about October 7th, but of course we have to talk about October 7th. And that's tomorrow night, and I'll wish you a Happy New Year, and I'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.
What about Rabbi?
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
Everybody
God bless.
have good Shabbos. Have a healthy
Yes.
2020.
Bye, friends.
Wonderful.